You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 312, the Huddy-Asgill Affair. By the spring of 1782, the main Continental Army under George Washington had settled back into defensive lines around British-occupied New York City. Following their loss at Yorktown, the British had given up on all offensive operations in America. Britain had begun discussing peace terms with American commissioners in Europe, and many believed the war would soon be over and British rule in America at an end. Now, there was one group who feared this result even more than the leaders in Britain. They were the Loyalists, American colonists who had stood by the king. They had also risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in this dispute. As it was coming to an end, that was proving to be a bad bet. They stood to lose everything, including possibly their lives if convicted of treason in the newly independent United States. They were living as outlaws or under British protection, and that protection might soon go away. The Loyalists, also called Tories, continued the war from British-occupied New York by continuing raids into New Jersey. And many of these Loyalists were New Jersey natives who had taken refuge in New York. Leading the effort was the Royal Governor of New Jersey, William Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's son remained a committed Loyalist, still fighting to bring the colonies back under Crown rule. Even after Yorktown, the Loyalists continued their raids, by some accounts becoming even more brutal. British General Henry Clinton noted that he believed these Loyalist refugees in New York intended to prevent, quote, all future reconciliation between Great Britain and the revolted colonies. In late March of 1782, the Loyalists conducted a raid on the town that is today known as Toms River, New Jersey. They targeted the town's salt works. About 40 Loyalists took whaleboats to make the 50-mile journey to the Patriots down on the New Jersey coast. The Patriots at Toms River were commanded by a man named Joshua Jack Huddy. Captain Huddy was an active patriot and a longtime leader in the New Jersey militia. He'd spent much of the early war fighting his Loyalist neighbors, forcing many of them to take refuge in New York. Many Loyalists asserted that Huddy was a murderer who had no compunctions about executing Loyalists when they were discovered in New Jersey. One particularly notable event happened in 1777. Huddy was involved with a group that captured and hanged an alleged spy named Stephen Edwards, who was taken from his bed at night, given a quick trial, and then hanged. Later in the war, Huddy received a letter of marque from the Continental Congress, authorizing him to use his whaleboat to target British boats and settlements along the New Jersey coast. Huddy had some successful seizures, which he sold at auction at Toms River. Huddy's reputation made him a target to be killed or captured. In September of 1780, a Loyalist force, led by an escaped slave named Titus, tried to capture Huddy. Titus was an active Loyalist, given the name of Colonel Ty for his efforts on behalf of the Loyalists during the ongoing guerrilla war in New Jersey. Colonel Ty surrounded Huddy's home with several dozen Loyalists. Huddy managed to hold out for some time with the help of only a servant girl who reloaded muskets as he fired from multiple locations inside the house. Huddy apparently had a whole cache of muskets that he had confiscated from other Loyalists in the area. Eventually, though, the Loyalists set the house on fire, forcing Huddy to surrender. The Loyalists tied up Huddy and put him aboard a whaleboat for a return to New York as a prisoner. The local militia turned out in time to attack the Loyalists. They got into a firefight, killing 6 of the enemy, and during that fight, Huddy himself was shot in the hip, probably by his would-be rescuers. He still managed to escape his captors and swim back to freedom. The following summer, Huddy had largely recovered from his wound and took command of the blockhouse at Toms River. When the Loyalists attacked in March of 1782, Huddy commanded about 25 Patriot militia, who took refuge in the blockhouse. Eventually, they ran out of ammunition and had to surrender to the larger attacking force. The raiders burned the town and carried Huddy back to New York in a whaleboat, this time successfully. There, the militia captain was held in the notorious Sugar House prison for a time and also aboard a prison ship in New York Harbor. The British then transferred Huddy to William Franklin's Loyalists, believing they wanted to trade him for a Loyalist prisoner that was being held in New Jersey. Instead, other events intervened. About the same time the Loyalists captured Huddy, another Loyalist, Philip White, also crossed enemy lines into New Jersey. There are conflicting accounts of what White was doing in New Jersey. According to some accounts, he was conducting a raid. According to others, he just snuck over to visit his wife. In any event, White was a wanted man. As a member of Franklin's Associated Loyalists, White had participated in the past in numerous raids in New Jersey, killing and wounding several patriots. 2 years earlier, White had been part of an attack on the home of a patriot named John Russell. In that attack, Russell was wounded and his father was killed. When White returned to New Jersey in late March 1782, Russell managed to capture the man who had killed his father. Exactly what happened next is also a matter of dispute, but the undisputed part is that White was killed. The Patriots claim that White was shot and killed while trying to escape. The Loyalists in New York believed that the Patriots, and specifically Russell, was avenging his father, and they had killed White in cold blood and then mutilated his body and buried him in a shallow grave. Huddy, of course, had nothing to do with the death of White. He was in British custody at the time of White's death. But when word of White's death reached the Loyalists in New York, they were outraged. White's brother-in-law, Loyalist Captain Richard Lippincott, took custody of Huddy. He and his men promptly took him to a tree at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and on April 2nd unceremoniously hanged him without trial. They put a placard on his body that read, "Up goes Huddy for Philip White." The New Jersey militia, friends of Huddy, recovered his body and the placard. The militia called on Washington to take action regarding this outrageous murder of a prisoner of war. Otherwise, the militia would stop taking prisoners when they were capturing Loyalists. New Jersey was in danger of becoming much more like we see a lot in the southern colonies, where prisoners were routinely murdered after battle. The execution of an American prisoner was something Washington had to take very seriously. Ever since the war began, Britain had threatened to treat American prisoners as captured criminals guilty of treason and subject to hanging. The only reason this didn't happen was likely due to threats by Washington and others in the American leadership that if American prisoners were hanged, that they would soon be hanging British prisoners. You'll remember less than a year before this most recent incident, the British had called the Americans' bluff by hanging Colonel Isaac Hayne in Charleston, something we went over in episode 293. The Americans had threatened retaliation then, but ended up doing nothing. Now, the Continental leadership was faced with a second execution. There had to be some sort of response. Washington received word of Huddy's hanging in a letter from the Monmouth, New Jersey militia. He was staying in Newburgh, New York at the time. Within days, he convened a council of general officers and regimental commanders at West Point. 24 officers participated in the deliberations. Major General William Heath was the senior officer in the committee. Also, Major Generals Robert Howe and the Baron von Steuben were participants. Washington submitted all the documents he had and asked the council to answer 4 questions. First, upon the state of facts in the above case, is retaliation justifiable and expedient? Second, if justifiable, ought it to take place immediately, or should a previous representation be made to Sir Henry Clinton and satisfaction be demanded from him? Third, in the case of representation and demand, who should be the person or persons to be required? Fourth, in case of refusal and retaliation becoming necessary, of what description shall the officer be on whom it is to take place, and how shall he be designated for the purpose? Each officer wrote out his own answer to each question. On the first, they unanimously agreed that, yes, retaliation was justifiable and expedient. On the second question, the vast majority thought a demand of satisfaction to General Clinton would be appropriate, although a minority argued that there should just be immediate action. Hang someone right now, no more words. To the third question, the majority believed that they should demand Captain Lippincott, the Loyalist officer who was in command of the party that hanged Huddy. He should be turned over for trial and execution. And to the fourth question, if the demand for Lippincott be refused, the majority answered that a British captain should be selected at random and executed. Several officers qualified this by saying that the selected captain should be one who was captured in battle, not one of those who were captured at Yorktown or Saratoga, where the officers and men who surrendered were promised certain guarantees of good treatment in exchange for their surrender. Washington acted on the answers, writing to President John Hanson to let Congress know what he was planning, and then to British General Clinton to demand that Lippincott be turned over, or that a British captain would be selected by lot and hanged. Hanson didn't respond because he never wrote letters, but Congress voted unanimously to support Washington's plans in this matter. Now, even before receiving Congress's response, Washington wrote to General Clinton to demand Lippincott, or whoever he thought was responsible, to be turned over, and if not, Washington would order a British captain executed in his place. Washington told Clinton, quote, "To save the innocent, I demand the guilty." Clinton's response expressed, quote, "surprise and displeasure at the tone of Washington's letter and its, quote, improper language." He assured Washington that he had only become aware of Huddy's hanging a few days before he received Washington's letter. Now, this was about a month after the incident took place. Clinton assured Washington that such an act of cruelty was not the policy of the British government, nor his personal standards. He had ordered an inquiry into events and would bring those responsible to trial. He scolded Washington for even considering hanging a British officer and called it an act of barbarity. Clinton also went on to say that it was up to each army to try and punish their own officers and men for such acts. What Clinton left out of his letter to Washington was the fact that this was not going to be his problem for much longer. On March 27th, about 2 weeks before Huddy's hanging, Clinton had received a letter from Lord Germain that his resignation as commander of North America had been accepted. The second day, Clinton received a second letter that had been written several weeks after Germain's letter. This second letter was from Germain's replacement, Wilbur Ellis. It informed Clinton that General Guy Carleton was on his way to replace Clinton. Until Carleton arrived, Clinton should turn over command to General James Robertson. Now, you may recall that in early episodes I said that Clinton hated Robertson. That was still the case, and Clinton simply refused to turn over command. Robertson, who was also the royal governor of New York, protested Clinton's refusal, but there really wasn't much else he could do. Clinton outranked Robertson within the military, and both men were also probably aware by this time that the North government had probably fallen or was still in the process of falling, so that getting any clear direction from London for a while would probably be impossible. And Clinton actually did take some action in the matter. After receiving Washington's letter, he ordered Lippincott arrested and held for court-martial. William Franklin, who, as I said, was the head of the Loyalists, objected that Lippincott was not a soldier and should not be tried by court-martial. Clinton ignored the objection and convened a court-martial of 16 officers headed by General Robertson. Clinton was pretty confident that this was not going to get resolved before he left, and he was right. The court-martial convened, but was still considering the matter when General Carleton arrived in New York on May 5th. Clinton hung around for another week before departing for London aboard a ship with the departing Hessian commander, General Wilhelm von Kniphausen. Clinton would return to begin his public feud with Cornwallis over who was responsible for Yorktown. Kniphausen was simply headed home for retirement. With no satisfactory response forthcoming from the British, Washington continued with the selection of a British captain to become the victim of American retaliation. Washington wrote to Colonel Moses Hazen, who was responsible for the British prisoners of war being held in western Pennsylvania and Maryland. He ordered that a British captain be selected by lot and sent to Philadelphia. Washington initially requested that an officer be selected from those who had been captured unconditionally in battle, not those who had surrendered and were given terms of protection as part of their surrender. However, when it turned out there were no captains that met the former criterion, Washington permitted lots to be selected among 13 captains who had been captured with the army at Yorktown. Remember that most officers at Yorktown had been paroled and allowed to go home. The only officers being held were those who had been retained to keep their enlisted prisoners in order. The officers gathered at the Black Bear Inn in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. When informed, the captains refused to draw lots. They viewed this entire process as immoral, illegal. They were not going to have any part in it. In response, the Americans simply put their names into a hat, and then in a second hat they placed 12 blanks and one paper that was marked "Unfortunate." A drummer boy then drew a slip from each hat. On the 11th draw, Captain Charles Asgill's name came up, along with the slip "Unfortunate." Asgill was the youngest captain in the group, having just turned 20 years old a few weeks earlier. He was also from an important family. His father had been Lord Mayor of London. Asgill joined the army at age 16 against the wishes of his father. He'd been promoted to captain less than a year earlier, a promotion he probably regretted at this point. Upon hearing his fate, his commanding officer told him only, quote, "For God's sakes, don't disgrace your colors." The unfortunate prisoner was carried first to Philadelphia and then to Chatham, New Jersey, the area where Captain Huddy had lived. He was kept under close confinement amid particularly hostile neighbors who, among other things, erected a gallows with a sign that said, "Up goes Asgill for Huddy." While there had been a pretty strong call for blood among the Americans after Huddy's hanging, once Asgill became the face of Americans' vengeance, opposition to his execution became more vocal. Even Colonel Alexander Hamilton wrote Washington saying that murdering an innocent man would greatly damage Washington's reputation. Now, Washington himself may have had second thoughts, but at this point he couldn't back down. He feared that doing so would mean that neither the British leadership nor anyone else would trust his resolve. Washington did delay the final execution, perhaps waiting for a determinative response from the British Army. General Carleton had suspended the Lippincott court-martial almost as soon as he arrived. He debated for a time actually just turning over Lippincott, who he regarded as a criminal. Turn him over to the Americans, make this whole thing go away. Doing that, of course, would drive nuts the British and Loyalists in New York, though. In June, Carleton also disbanded William Franklin's Association of Loyalists, which had taken Huddy from British custody. And about this same time, Franklin left New York for London. The court-martial was restored and eventually reached its decision in late June. The verdict? Not guilty. The court concluded that Lippincott had only been following orders given to him by William Franklin, and that he believed his actions were in the line of duty and not done out of any malice. Carleton then seemed to embark on a policy of procrastination to avoid any action against Asgill. And he wrote to Washington about the court decision in July, 2 weeks after it happened, but he failed to include the court records. Then, after more than a month, Carleton announced that the records were ready and asked for permission for Chief Justice William Smith to carry those records to Washington. Carleton said Smith was going to be there to provide a further explanation about everything. A frustrated Washington responded that he was sending General Heath to meet with an officer at the British front lines and that any explanation could be in writing. To that, Carleton responded that, okay, he's just going to mail the records and Washington would get them sometime soon. In this case, the mail took another 2 weeks to arrive, far longer than messages usually did. Having finally received the court records, Washington still hesitated to act. Instead, he forwarded the records to Congress and asked them again about what it wished to do. By this time, it was late August. Almost 5 months had passed since Huddy's hanging. The delay gave Asgill's advocates time to act, most specifically his mother, Lady Asgill. She wrote to the French Foreign Minister Vergennes, pleading for her son's life. Lady Asgill argued that her son had surrendered to the French at Yorktown under their word that he would be protected and not subject to reprisals. She called upon French honor to request her son's life be spared. Vergennes then passed the letter on to the King and Queen of France, resulting in a request from Queen Marie Antoinette requesting the release of Captain Asgill. Meanwhile, for months, Congress dithered and failed to reach a decision. The majority still wanted to hang Asgill. And finally, in November of 1782, after Congress had received the letter from Vergennes, They used that letter to justify a change in its determination. To keep good relations with France, it voted to release Asgill as a gift to the King of France. So, in late November, Asgill was released. The young captain rushed to New York, only to find that a British packet ship had just left for London. Anxious to return home, Asgill abandoned his luggage, commandeered a rowboat, and sailed out into the Atlantic after the ship. He managed to catch it, he boarded it, and returned home in time for Christmas. The Americans never took vengeance for Huddy's murder. However, the dispute, which lasted for about 8 months, maintained a particular state of bitterness between the two countries. Carleton had hoped to ease relations as the British reduced resources in America. He had also hoped to reach some plan for an exchange of prisoners. At this point, the Americans had about 12,000 prisoners. The result of this dispute over Captain Asgill kept the two sides at a higher level of hostility and prevented any large-scale prisoner exchange. Next week, we're going to head west again as the Americans push into Ohio Territory, hoping to put a stop to continued Indian raids in the area around Fort Pitt. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and the Sons of the American Revolution. And you can check out the Sons podcast at fastfunhistory.com. I also want to thank Robert Morris Circle supporters, Patrick LeBeau, and Kurt Avard for their continued support. I really appreciate everyone who can support this podcast financially. Everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon for as little as $2 a month has access to commercial-free episodes and a great deal of other things. Support at the $10 level gets a magnet each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. I also appreciate one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo, and also the support you can provide by using my book links to Amazon when you do your shopping. If you use a link for my books to get to Amazon, I get a small commission on your entire purchase, even if you don't buy the book. All of this helps to make this podcast possible. This week's episode was another real challenge for both leaders. Militia on both sides had engaged in some pretty horrific behavior, which the leaders had to address. Washington particularly gets criticism from historians for his plans to execute a British prisoner who had personally done nothing wrong. Sure, today this would be considered a war crime, although there was no such thing as a war crime in the 18th century. Washington's position was a difficult one. If murders like the ones that Britain had committed went without any reprisals, they would probably only continue. American soldiers, in turn, would probably likely kill more British prisoners, making their own retaliations. Washington realized all this and was doing his best to tamp down the passions on both sides. Sacrificing an innocent officer was certainly a high price to pay, but one can understand where Washington was coming from in suggesting this. Although Asgill escaped the hangman's noose, many American leaders still wanted to go after Richard Lippincott, who remained in New York City. The New Jersey Loyalist had clearly hanged Huddy, even if the British acquitted him by saying the hanging was somehow justifiable. The Americans certainly disagreed with that finding that it was justified. Lippincott had to flee as the British prepared to evacuate New York in 1783. If he had remained, he almost certainly would have been tried for murder, if not lynched prior to trial. Instead, he moved to Nova Scotia, received a grant of 3,000 acres near modern-day Toronto. When William Franklin left New York in 1782, it would be the last time he would see America. In London, he became a leading advocate for the Loyalists who were seeking compensation from the royal government for the sacrifices they had made during the war. In 1784, after the war ended, William wrote to his father, Benjamin Franklin, hoping for some sort of reconciliation. He would see his father briefly the following year when Benjamin visited London, but their meeting was mostly to resolve some legal claims. Benjamin wanted William to transfer some of the land he still owned in America to his son Temple, who had been acting as a secretary for his grandfather in France. Benjamin also largely cut William out of his will, noting that William, quote, acted against me in the late war. Now, years after the war ended, the Asgill affair became a political controversy once again. In 1786, Washington responded to suggestions that Asgill had been held under terrible conditions. Washington responded by releasing letters that showed he had ordered Asgill to be treated, quote, tenderly, but necessarily kept confined as a flight risk since he was under a death sentence. Asgill, who was living in England, of course, by this time, read about all this and wrote back to an editor in America outlining the abuse he had suffered during his imprisonment. Not only had he been closely confined, but he had also received substandard food that led to multiple bouts of illness. He also alleged that his guards had been bribed to allow locals into his bedroom who insulted and beat him. Asgill inherited his father's baronetcy a few years after his return to Britain. He also remained an active officer, rising to brigadier general in 1797. The following year, while helping to crush a rebellion in Ireland, General Asgill commuted the death sentence of an Irish rebel after the prisoner's wife pleaded to spare him. I've got to think that his own experience as a prisoner had some impact on his decision. My book recommendation this week is The Charles Asgill Affair, Setting the Record Straight by Anne Amundsen. This is a new book just published in 2023. The author is British, and the book is mostly written from the perspective of Charles Asgill. Amundsen helps bring to light the letter that Asgill wrote after the war, discussing the terrible conditions of his captivity. This is really the only book I found that focuses just on the Charles Asgill affair. It's a pretty substantial book at just over 300 pages. So if you really want to read more about the events that we talked about this week, get a copy of The Charles Asgill Affair, Setting the Record Straight. There are lots of good options for an online recommendation, including a pretty good video where Amundsen expands on the topic that she wrote about in her book. There's also a great many letters by George Washington or to George Washington that outline the series of incidents that took place in the events that we discussed this week. All of these sources are listed in my blog entry for this episode. You just go to the very bottom of the entry and you'll see all my online and reading recommendations. You can always access this at blog.amrevpodcast.com. But my recommendation this week, and I can only pick one, is a book that's simply called The History of Chatham, New Jersey by Ambrose Vanderpoel. This book covers a number of important events from the war and includes a lot of the primary documents that are related to those events. It's a lengthy book that covers, as I said, many different events from the war, but the last 70 pages of the book are devoted to the Huddy-Asgill affair. Now, since this book is written from the perspective of Huddy's friends and neighbors, I think it provides a nice balance to Amundsen's more pro-Asgill viewpoint. As always, you can find direct links to my recommendation, not only on my blog, but on my website and on the podcast platform that you use to download this recording. My question this week asks, what was the Catholic Church's position during the American Revolutionary War? Well, the Vatican in the 1700s was very different than the one that exists today. The Papal States ruled much of what is today northern Italy. This meant that the Pope was very much a political leader in Europe, not just the head of a church. During this period, the church was also much more conservative and very content with monarchy ruling over Europe. The Pope at the time, Pope Pius VI, did not comment directly on the revolution or the war with Great Britain, but in 1775 he did publish comments that were highly critical of the Enlightenment thinking that inspired the American Revolution. He said in part, quote, "When they have spread this darkness abroad and torn religion out of men's hearts, these accursed philosophers proceed to destroy the bonds of union among men, both those which unite them to their rulers and those which urge them to their duty. They keep proclaiming that man is born free and subject to no one, that society accordingly is a crowd of foolish men who stupidly yield to priests who deceive them and to kings who oppress them, so that the harmony of priest and ruler is only a monstrous conspiracy against the innate liberty of man." Given that Britain was anti-Catholic and that Catholic France had formed an alliance with the U.S. colonies, the Pope probably did not have much incentive to really support either side. The Papal States never granted diplomatic status to the American commissioners in Europe, but this may have had more to do with the fact that the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which held a great political influence over the Papal States, had also refused recognition. Now, there were Catholics in America. Many of them fought for independence, and one was even a signer of the Declaration. There were no American bishops at the time, so whatever constituted the Catholic Church in America had little to say at all. Like the rest of Europe, the Pope accepted the outcome of the war and adapted to it. When an independent U.S. became a reality, the Pope granted a request to separate the U.S. Catholic Church from the British one. The first American bishop was John Carroll of Maryland, an active supporter of the independence movement, and a cousin to the signer of the Declaration, Charles Carroll. The Pope also approved consular relations with the U.S. in 1797. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.